And welcome to Taking Screenshots with me, your host, Bob Cluck, not Bob Ross. I'm going to take you through some of the basics with screenshots. Mostly I think what we'll focus on is the important thing is for event banners. So we want to get the lining up for event banners done properly. So the main thing start with is get your car and the track and try and match up the settings if you can for either qualifying or one of the races, but just match it up so it's got the right dates, the right time and the right weather conditions. What I'm doing just for this screenshot to mess about with is I've just picked a random date. We've got this sort of early afternoon with a bit of time progression, just so we can get a slight feel for the weather changing as well. It's just only for this, it doesn't really make any odds. But yeah, there's the key thing really is in the photo mode bit. It's the first screen where you've got access to the aperture and zoom length and all that malarkey. Thanks Ben, go, we're going. So we'll boot it out of here with my appalling controller driving. So let's go to that view, see what we can see. Doobie-doo-doo. Right. Oh lordy, it's close, crap. So let's go here. Right, and let's just pop the view to external view and pop down to photo mode. I'm probably a bit too close to the fence for this, for doing a banner shot. Actually, can work from this side. Key thing with banner shots is to bear in mind you've got to imagine, if I just get rid of this, you've got to imagine the banner on your screen. So we've got to think of the border around it. So you've got the main logo bit over here. Obviously, I know we've got ranked event gone now, but the logo, pcars2 logo stuff in there, and then you've got the actual shot itself, and then the name of the event. So for this, for example, we should probably be going a little bit over to the. That's probably too far over, but yeah, a little bit more central. So we've got an idea of we could have the event name just under here, so it'll work quite well actually lined up. If you zoomed in too close, you're not going to get the banner done properly. So I want to zoom out a little bit. Actually, it's worth looking at this, for example, as we zoom in with the motion blur on. You get these weird artifacts occasionally. So we've got this stuff under here where the motion blur is just having a bit of a shit fit. So try and watch for those little details when you're taking a shot, because otherwise it can end up making it look completely and utterly shite. If we pull the details back up again, what I normally try and do with the aperture is run around about anywhere between f6 and f8. If you watch this, we've got a certain amount of bloom over the rear court, the rear arch here at f6. We drop it to f7. Increase it to f7. That's gone, and there's a slight change on the windscreen here, so we've got slightly less kind of bloomed out. It's I don't know, it's personal preference, but you could go to that, for example. So there's more more sun reflection on the glass, so you get a slightly more realistic look there. But yeah, generally just play about with the aperture, but try and keep it so between sort of f5 normally and f8 is about the maximum. If you go too high on the aperture, you can end up making everything far too sharp. The whole image comes into focus, which looks a bit rubbish. Focal length touched on. Generally, it's how far. If you go like that, for example, you end up with almost sort of fisheye, but it looks a bit rubbish. And if you zoomed right in, you'd need to pull the camera a long way back. Generally for these sorts of shots, below 30 works very well. So we're going to stick on 27 here for this one. Focus distance, you can actually use this to trick the system. By default it will auto-focus on where it's pointing at, or an object it's pointing at. So if you've got the car in the centre of the shot, then it'll auto-focus on that. But the moment you change the focus distance manually, you can then move the camera backwards and forwards, and you can actually then defocus the car slightly to get it so it's a slightly more realistic photo. So it's more for if you're actually taking a screenshot for pleasure rather than for an event, or for a banner. We're going to go with about there. We'll try and pretend this is for a banner, even though it's not. Bokeh shape, normally basically mess about between 0 and 1. There's barely any difference between 1, 2 and 3. There's a subtle difference more than anything. Obviously the shutter speed is really going to affect the blur, so it's just down to personal preference. But yeah, the lower the shutter speed, the more motion blur, the more feel actual kind of in motion things are. And when you've got those where are we, that artifacts like that, for example under the tyres under here, you'd need to increase the shutter speed to get rid of it. So you can see it's almost completely gone. You'd only really see it if you're looking for it now, but if you drop down to the lowest level, for example, it's now really obvious. Yeah, if we go back and just change the camera position a bit, there we go, that's got rid of it anyway. Tracking speed normally you wouldn't need to mess with. It's only if you've got something where the car is in the middle of a corner, for example, and it's slightly out of focus, just when you're trying to, when you've paused it to take the shot, then you can mess about with the tracking speed to actually get the car back in focus. So really the key ones to focus on are the aperture at the top and focal length, and then shutter speed really for the, just whether you want some kind of real feel to the action. Real problem with having the shutter speed at a high level, although it might be more realistic in terms of what a photograph would capture, you've got to remember that background details tend to be a bit pony in most games. So by giving the shutter speed, a low shutter speed to get the motion blur, you're actually masking a lot of the low detail and some of the shortcuts the manufacturer, well, SMS and everyone else has to do. Otherwise you end up with, you get these massive 3D trees that look great, but you get about 2 frames a second. So yeah, try and run a low shutter speed, or short shutter speed, and you end up with a quite a nice image overall that can work quite well. And then it comes down to the filter. I know one person online tends to use faded a lot. I think it just looks too faded myself. I mean, if you start with faded and then drop the intensity, it might work quite well. But as it is, it's just too faded out. Process depends on the image. For nighttime shots, that can work quite well. You need to mess about with the contrast and exposure to get the best out of it. So you could increase that and then maybe darken that up a little bit, but also just drop it down a little bit from the 100% maybe. But yeah, not often used a lot. Transfer I do use quite often. It's a really heavy contrast filter, so you have to be sort of fairly careful with the contrast after that. Don't tend to want to go too high on it, but yeah, depending on the amount of light in the image, just play about with the exposure. But I tend to run sort of around about 1.2 to 1.4 as additional exposure, and more if it's for certain filters, and also if it's a sort of early evening or nighttime shot, you really want to start improving the exposure. Vignette, try and keep 40% maximum. If you get to sort of 48%, you really need to be zoomed right in on the car. You need to have the face of the car real frame. The car itself is the image. When it's something like this, a subtle amount for banners completely pointless. But yeah, try and do around about 30%, 28, something like that. So you get a subtle sort of just takes the edge off the edges. Frame, don't bother with. It's just crap. unless you want to try and pretend that you're taking it from a TV shot, but frankly I never use it, it's rubbish. Contrast, again, just play about with the settings, see what they look like. Same with exposure. Saturation, sometimes it might just, you might feel it's too saturated, it's just too much colour, so maybe drop it down 1 or 2 notches. Film grain can work really well to mask some of the really sharp lines. So if you add around about 28-40% on a normal image, when you zoom in and for example around here, when you look at the final image, it can actually really end up looking like a photo, because you get just a certain amount of photograph grain in there. Works really, really well. Don't go too high on it, because you end up sort of actually washing the image out, and then when you look at the photo finally, it's just way too much loss of detail, and it just doesn't look that authentic. If it's a nighttime shot, then yeah, by all means add a bit more grain, but during the daylight time, 24%, maybe 28% works quite well. Chromatic aberration, mess about with, see if you like the result of it. I tend to run it regularly on around about 24-28%. Much more than that and it starts to blur the image and makes people go a bit cross-eyed trying to focus on it. It can end up making it hard to look at the image. But again, 24-28% works really well for just, I don't know, it adds a certain touch to the image that works quite well and takes some of the sharpness of the detail out. It can end up giving a slightly more accurate image. Then when you're happy, you've got it all framed and it's nicely positioned for exactly where you want it, take the screenshot and there you go. And then if you want to take a slightly different angle, obviously just move the camera around. Actually that might work quite well if we go zoomed right in on this and maybe drop down and zoom in. And I think what we'll do with this one, for example, is not there. Is we'll go quite heavy on the vignette for this one, and maybe we'll change that to like high contrast can end up being quite good for natural looking shots when you overexpose it, but you quite often might need to just drop the saturation down. So if you can see in the grass over here, it's really very saturated green. You just want to drop that down a little bit, or even just increase the film grain a bit, which will help as well. But you've then got a kind of a more of a magazine shot, for example, with that heavy vignetting, for example, can work quite well with that sort of shot when you're really right in on the car. Yeah, you want to go, oops, that's probably gone a bit too far out, but you get the idea. It's just a case of lining it up, seeing what works and what doesn't work. But let's try and get some focus in again. So now it's starting to look a little bit too much like a game rather than what would be a real photo, and that's just way too sharp as an actual image. It's just not something you would see. And I didn't really get the tyres, the wheels pointing on the counter steering to really set that off properly, but you get the idea. That's basically all there is to it. That's really how I take the shots. Not a lot to it. It's all very simple, really. Oh, hello. Blimey, quite like that. Let's just drop that back down again. I'm going to need to mess about with that vignette. Too much on the vignette. Yeah. Let's go a bit more on there. Maybe another one that can work well. Sunny day, indigo. Try and drop the filter intensity right down. Crushed blues I've used quite a bit as well, but you tend to often again maybe just drop the intensity down from the maximum. But again, here we can see we've got this problem with the there's white stuff under the tyres, so I just need to pull the camera back a little bit so that's gone. So we're trying to get a feel for the whole image. Actually, what really ruins this now is the motion blur around the edges of the car. So that's just taking the edge off that shot completely just there, with that part. But if we move the camera just away from that a little bit, got something that might work. No, this is always a problem. You change one bit, you move it slightly from one direction, it just doesn't work. But you know, angle it up however you want it. Just watch, say, for little artifacts like one's appeared here, and then here, for example, the shadow doesn't really line up with the tyre properly. So you just gotta just watch for stuff like that when you're taking a shot, because it can just really ruin what's otherwise quite a good shot, which is something that's a fairly trivial detail that you've just missed. I've done that far too many times that I would care to admit. And I think I shall stop my narration there. Bye bye!